The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the Montana plains, turning the horizon into a canvas of golden amber. Daniel Hayes, the lone rancher, worked methodically, repairing a fence that had been battered by the wind and wandering cattle. Life on the ranch was demanding, and solitude had become his constant companion over the years. The vast emptiness around him, which many would find oppressive, felt like home, yet even he sometimes admitted that the quiet weighed heavily. It was on such a quiet evening that something unexpected happened, something that would forever alter the rhythm of his life. At the edge of the property, a figure appeared, small and fragile against the sweeping landscape. Daniel squinted, shielding his eyes from the sun, unsure whether it was a traveler or simply a trick of the light. As she drew closer, he saw the determination in her posture despite her evident exhaustion. She was a young woman, her dark hair falling in a straight curtain down her back, her clothes worn but neat. Her eyes were alert, scanning the ranch as though searching for a place where she could finally belong. Daniel's first instinct was caution. Strangers were rare in these parts, but he felt an inexplicable pull, a sense that this was someone extraordinary. "Are you lost?" he called out, his voice steady but not unkind. The woman nodded almost imperceptibly, and when she spoke, it was barely audible, yet unmistakably earnest. I need work and shelter." Daniel studied her for a moment. There was a vulnerability to her words, but beneath it lay a quiet strength that reminded him of the resilience the plains demanded. Without hesitation, he gestured for her to follow him toward the ranch house, noting how carefully she moved, mindful of every step over the uneven terrain. Once inside, Daniel offered her a modest meal of bread, cheese, and stew. He watched as she ate slowly, deliberately, as if every bite counted, and he sensed the weight of her journey pressing down upon her. Between bites, she began to tell fragments of her story, a long journey from China, a life constrained by expectations she could no longer bear, and a fierce desire for freedom that had driven her across the world. Her voice was soft but determined, and Daniel found himself captivated by the way she spoke, so far from his own life, yet somehow familiar in its yearning for independence. When their hands brushed while passing the food, she looked up at him, and in a whisper that barely rose above the crackling of the fire, said, "You're bigger than I thought." Daniel blinked, startled by the intimacy of her words, but a small, knowing smile tugged at the corners of his lips. There was a spark, quiet yet undeniable, between them, a recognition that they were two solitary souls searching for connection in unexpected places. As night settled over the ranch, the wind sighing through the fields, Daniel realized that offering her shelter had become more than an act of kindness. He was drawn to protect her, to share this rugged, lonely world with someone who had walked so far to find freedom. And as Mei Lin settled near the fire, her gaze lingering on him with a mixture of curiosity and admiration, both understood that their lives had just begun to intertwine in ways neither of them could yet fully grasp. The morning sun crept over the rolling Montana plains, turning the dew on the grass into a blanket of tiny diamonds. Daniel Hayes emerged from the ranch house to find Mei Lin already awake, standing at the edge of the corral. She watched the cattle with a quiet intensity, her hands clasped in front of her, taking in every detail of the sprawling ranch. There was a confidence in her stance, tempered by the slight hesitation of someone still learning the ways of this rugged land. Daniel, observing her from the doorway, felt a swell of admiration. She had traveled thousands of miles to be here, and now she faced the vastness of his world with courage he found both surprising and inspiring. Without a word, he handed her a pair of worn leather gloves and a wide-brimmed hat. Her eyes widened slightly at the gesture, and for a moment, Daniel wondered if she would hesitate. But she didn't. Taking a deep breath, she slipped them on and followed him into the corral, where the early morning air carried the scents of hay, dust, and the faint tang of livestock. Today, she would learn the rhythm of the ranch, how to feed the cattle, mend fences, and handle the stubborn animals that often tested even the most experienced ranchers. Daniel watched as she approached her tasks with determination. Her first attempt at roping a calf was clumsy, the rope tangling around her arms, but she refused to give up. With careful instruction and patient guidance, she adjusted her movements, and soon she was handling the calf with a surprising degree of skill. Daniel couldn't help but smile to himself. There was a natural grace to her efforts, an elegance that stood out against the rough, earthy work of the ranch. "You're a quick learner," he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine respect. Mei Lin looked up at him, a small, tired smile on her lips. "I have to be," she replied softly. "I can't afford to fail." Daniel felt a strange warmth at her words, a mixture of pride and protectiveness he hadn't expected. He found himself watching her more closely, noticing the way her hair fell across her forehead, the concentration in her dark eyes, and the subtle strength in her movements. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, resilient, determined, and quietly fearless. As the sun climbed higher, they paused for a simple meal, sitting side by side on the wooden fence. Conversation flowed naturally, shifting from stories of distant lands and the challenges of her journey to his own tales of life on the ranch. He spoke of his parents, the harsh lessons of solitude, and the pride he took in the land he had inherited and nurtured. Mei Lin listened intently, occasionally interjecting with questions or observations, and Daniel realized that this quiet woman had already become an essential part of his world. As the day drew to a close, Mei Lin leaned against the fence, her gaze fixed on him. The wind stirred the ends of her hair, and in a whisper, she repeated the words she had said the first night, "You're bigger than I thought." Daniel chuckled softly, shaking his head with a mixture of amusement and admiration. "And you're braver than I imagined," he said. In that moment, both understood that something deeper had begun to grow between them, a bond formed not just of words, but of shared effort, trust, and the quiet thrill of discovering someone who might just change your life forever. This episode builds on their relationship, showing trust, admiration, and growing intimacy while keeping the story rich in Montana ranch life. 2 weeks had passed since Mei Lin had arrived at the ranch, and the rhythm of their days had become intertwined. They worked side by side from sunrise to sunset, her confidence growing with each chore, and Daniel couldn't help but admire her adaptability. The bond between them, once tentative and cautious, had strengthened, unspoken yet undeniable. It was on one of these seemingly ordinary days that nature decided to test them both. The sky darkened suddenly, thick clouds rolling across the plains as though a storm was brewing from nowhere. Daniel felt the familiar tightening in his chest. The wind before a tempest always carried an electric warning. He began securing the cattle and checking the fences with practiced efficiency, while Mei Lin followed close behind, her movements sure and steady despite the rising gusts. Rain began to fall, first in light droplets, then quickly thickening into sheets that soaked them to the skin and plastered hair against their faces. The wind whipped through the corral, sending hay and dust flying, and the cattle grew restless, their lowing blending with the roar of the storm. Daniel called out instructions, his voice cutting through the chaos, and Mei Lin obeyed without hesitation, helping to guide the animals to shelter. When one particularly stubborn steer tried to bolt, she stepped in fearlessly, her hands steady as she coaxed it back with quiet authority. Daniel caught himself staring, heart swelling with a mixture of admiration and something more dangerous, a deep, protective feeling that made him want to shield her from every gust of wind, every hardship of the plains. As the storm intensified, they took refuge in the barn, seeking shelter among the hay bales. The wind howled outside, rattling the doors and windows, and the rain pounded the roof like 1,000 drums. They huddled close together on the loft, shivering from cold and adrenaline alike. Mei Lin's voice, soft and trembling, broke the tense silence. "I didn't think I could survive out here," she admitted, her eyes wide and vulnerable. Daniel's hand found hers instinctively, gripping it firmly yet gently. "You're stronger than you know," he said, his voice low and certain. The storm raged on, but inside the small loft, a quiet intimacy blossomed. They spoke little, instead relying on the closeness of shared survival, the electricity of hands pressed together, and the comfort of being seen and understood. Mei Lin leaned closer, her breath warm against his arm, and whispered once more, the words that had lingered since their first meeting, "You're bigger than I thought." Daniel's smile was faint but full of promise, his heart beating faster than the storm outside. When the rain finally slowed and the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, Daniel helped Mei Lin down from the loft. Mud clung to their boots, and their clothes were soaked, yet neither noticed. The storm had passed, but its impact lingered, the thrill of survival, the trust they had forged, and the unspoken realization that they were no longer merely companions but something far more intimate. Mei Lin looked up at him, eyes shimmering with a mixture of awe and something deeper, and Daniel, still holding her gaze, knew in that instant that nothing on the plains, no storm, no distance, could ever keep them apart. This 500-word expansion heightens tension, builds trust, and deepens the romantic connection during a dramatic storm scene. The days following the storm were calm, almost serene, as though the plains themselves were giving Daniel and Mei Lin a moment to breathe. The ranch, bathed in the soft glow of early morning, seemed to sparkle after the rain, and even the cattle appeared more settled, moving quietly across the fields. Daniel found himself watching Mei Lin more than usual, noticing the way sunlight caught in her hair, the way her hands moved with a careful precision when feeding the animals, and the way her laughter, soft yet genuine, could momentarily erase the fatigue of the long day. He realized that her presence had become indispensable, not just for the work she helped with, but for the subtle warmth and life she brought into his quiet existence. Mei Lin, too, was learning to read Daniel beyond the rugged exterior he presented to the world. She noticed the moments when his jaw tightened with thought, the small sighs when he surveyed the land, and the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, especially in quiet, unguarded moments. She felt a growing respect for him, but also a deep admiration in something that surprised her, a fluttering, nervous awareness of his nearness, the magnetic pull that drew her closer even as she tried to hide it. One evening, as the sky blazed with colors of crimson and gold, Daniel led Mei Lin to the edge of the ranch where the horizon stretched unbroken. The plains, vast and endless, seemed to echo the emotions neither had yet spoken aloud. "I never thought I'd find someone who fits here, with me," he said quietly, his voice blending with the rustling of the grass. Mei Lin's heart quickened at his words. She felt the weight of her journey, the miles traveled and the hardships endured, culminating in this singular moment of connection. She turned to face him, the light of the sunset illuminating her face. Her lips parted, and she whispered, almost as if afraid to disturb the fragile intimacy of the moment, "You're bigger than I thought." The words were no longer playful, no longer simply an observation of his physical presence. They carried layers of meaning, of awe and tentative desire, and Daniel felt them sink deep into his chest. He stepped closer, closing the space between them, and gently took her hand in his. The touch was electric, sending warmth through both of them despite the cool evening air. "And you're the one I've been waiting for," he said, his tone steady, yet full of emotion. There was no hesitation in his words, no question of what he felt or what he wanted. In that quiet moment, the vast plains around them seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them, bound by trust, respect, and a growing, undeniable love. They stood there for a long time, hands entwined, hearts quietly acknowledging what words could not fully capture. In the fading light, Daniel knew that this was more than attraction, it was a promise, a beginning, a recognition that their lives, once separate and solitary, were now intertwined. Mei Lin, feeling the strength and gentleness of his presence, understood the truth in his words, and a sense of belonging settled within her for the first time since her long journey had begun. The sun disappeared beyond the horizon, but the warmth between them lingered, an unspoken vow that neither distance nor time could erase. This expansion deepens their emotional intimacy, showing the beginnings of confessions and the mutual acknowledgement of love while keeping the ranch setting vivid. Winter had arrived on the Montana plains, covering the vast ranch in a blanket of pristine snow. The cold air bit at their cheeks as Daniel and Mei Lin worked side by side, tending the cattle and maintaining the fences, their breaths forming small clouds that mingled in the crisp air. Life on the ranch had always been hard, but with Mei Lin by his side, Daniel found a new rhythm, one filled not only with labor but with companionship and warmth. The quiet of the plains no longer felt like loneliness, it had become the backdrop to something far greater, a connection that neither of them could ignore. As the day drew to a close, Daniel led Mei Lin into the stable, where the horses nickered softly and the scent of hay mixed with the faint warmth of the fire he had built. The sky outside was painted with the soft purples and golds of sunset, reflecting off the snow in a way that made the entire ranch glow. Daniel stopped, turning to face her, and in the calm of the evening, he felt a courage he had never summoned before. His hands, rough from years of work, found hers, holding them gently but firmly. "You've changed everything here," he began, his voice low, steady, and full of emotion, "and you've changed me. I never knew I could feel this way about anyone." Mei Lin's heart beat faster at his words, and her dark eyes glistened with emotion. She had come to the ranch seeking shelter and a new life, but she had never imagined that she would find a home for her heart as well. She looked up at him, her breath catching, and whispered softly, the same words that had become almost a refrain in their time together, "You're bigger than I thought." This time, Daniel's smile was broader, warmer, and filled with certainty. He stepped closer, closing the small distance between them, and lifted her hand to his lips, brushing them gently against his own. "And now, you're mine," he said, his voice firm, unyielding, and filled with love. The snow fell silently around them, the wind carrying the faint scent of pine and earth, and in that moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them. Daniel's arms enveloped her, strong and protective, while Mei Lin rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. There was no need for more words, the trust, love, and passion between them spoke louder than anything either could say. As night settled over the ranch, the stars twinkled brightly above, casting their gentle light across the snow-covered plains. Inside the small, warm house, Daniel and Mei Lin shared a quiet meal and exchanged stories of the future they imagined together, dreams of children, laughter, and life built hand in hand. The ranch, once a place of solitude, had become a home filled with warmth, trust, and a love that promised to endure through every season. And so, Daniel Hayes, the lone rancher, claimed not just a partner, but a companion, a confidant, and a bride. Mei Lin, having traveled across continents and braved countless hardships, found in him the home and love she had long sought. Together, they faced the vast Montana plains, their hearts intertwined, their lives forever changed by the courage to trust, the willingness to love, and the unshakable bond they had forged. This 500-word episode concludes the story with romance, resolution, and a strong sense of belonging, completing the emotional arc of Daniel and Mei Lin.